Hey, I get questions from time to time, and I just got another question today asking me about veganism in terms of a utopian project, in terms of the objectives of veganism being utopia. And this is actually an issue that I feel I have spoken about in the past, although perhaps it came up in passing, and perhaps the depth of my sincerity in the matter wasn't really clear. In contrast to many of the over-the-top save the world messages that some vegans broadcast, in contrast to the revolutionary claims, sometimes including violent claims and terrorist type claims that a lot of vegans indulge in, my pragmatic, down-to-earth approach to veganism instead insists on comparing it to the struggle to abolish cigarette smoking, the use of tobacco. And it is interesting and significant that in the history we've all lived through, even if you're only a teenager today, you're old enough to have seen some of the social change surrounding this. We haven't abolished cigarette smoking by making cigarettes illegal, by some kind of sudden or violent overnight change. There's certainly nothing utopian about it. There's nothing revolutionary about it. But step by step, cultural attitudes have changed, personal habits have changed, and scientific research and its findings have become more and more broadly understood and taken more and more seriously. The morality of smoking cigarettes, the cultural consensus on that has shifted indescribably and dramatically in the space of 100 years. Even in the last 50 years, so much has changed. For a pregnant woman to smoke cigarettes is now considered evil. And there are good scientific reasons for that. But actually, the science was already established basically around World War II. It took a very long time for that to become widely understood, accepted, and kind of appropriated into the culture as something people care about. The perception that as a smoker, you are a bad person is now very real. There's a stigma attached to it. And I'm sure many smokers suffer for that reason. Like, I don't say that without some sympathy. More and more jobs now, if you want to smoke cigarettes, well, you definitely can't smoke in the office. You probably can't smoke anywhere in the office building. You've got to go downstairs and go outside. You can just barely manage to smoke while holding down the job. And your employer isn't supposed to fire you for being a smoker. That would be unfair discrimination. But probably everyone's looking at you funny when you disappear for 15 minutes and you weren't really supposed to be having a break, but you felt you needed a cigarette. It's a drag. And all of society, step by step, is more and more heavily slanted against tobacco consumption. And meanwhile, it hasn't disappeared. I just checked the stats before making this video. In Canada, where I happen to be living, the rate of smoking has dropped over the last 5 years approximately from 21% to about 18%. So it's not a sudden or dramatic change. Some of that change is just because older people who smoke cigarettes are dying of old age, and some of it is because younger people are actually making the effort to quit smoking. I have no reason to think that that will ever reach 0%. And even if it did reach 0%, that wouldn't be a utopia, that wouldn't be a revolution, that wouldn't be anything else. But on a really deep level of cultural values, how do you feel if your daughter tells you she's got a new boyfriend and she wants to get married to him, and he's a chain smoker? Whether it's fair or unfair, you probably regard that as a bad thing, and you may be biased and regard him as a bad guy simply because he smokes, or maybe the first thing you notice about him, the first thing you learn about him, is that he's a chain smoker. He's smoking all the time. Same with the gender's reverse. If it's your son who's got a new girlfriend and he tells you, hey, I want you to meet my girlfriend, we're going to get married, but the first thing you see is that she's a chain smoker. This has a powerful social significance, a moral value attached to it that it didn't have at all 100 years ago. This has changed. And to some extent, all of us have witnessed the change. And even though there have been, changes in government policy, changes in laws, changes in the way tobacco is packaged and sold, I think the most profound and important change is at that level of ethics and of cultural values surrounding the ethical decisions we make. I did already use this one example in an earlier video. Today, even if you smoke yourself, You do not want your children to smoke. You're not proud if your son and daughter start smoking, even if you yourself are still a smoker. It's a huge and fundamental change. And it's very difficult to imagine that within my lifetime, you would see a lot of people around who say, well, I still eat meat, I still eat beef, I still eat bacon, but I recognize it's not good for my health. I recognize it's not good ethically. I recognize it's not good ecologically. And I'm not really happy to see my kids picking up the same bad habits I had. That would be meat eating coming into the same realm of questions as cigarette smoking, etc. And again, so I just mentioned cigarette smoking in Canada dropping down to 18% of the population. It's quite possible that it's going to reach some kind of stasis at maybe 10%. Maybe it'll never drop below 10% of the population. Maybe there will always be a minority of people who are smoking tobacco, despite this kind of stigma it carries. Ultimately, I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable living in a society where people have the freedom to choose to smoke tobacco, because we all know the reality is all the people around us have the freedom to use cocaine, heroin, and so on, even though they are illegal, right? Heavy questions, but for me, this is very far removed from Utopia. Ironically, by the way, I'm currently in the running to go and deliver an academic paper at an international conference on Thomas More's Utopia, on the philosophy of Utopia, on utopianism in the strictest sense as a philosophy and as an historical phenomenon. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go to that academic conference or not. Nice to be invited. As they say at the Oscars, nice to be nominated. So I do not think of veganism in these utopian terms, and I would warn anyone who thinks of utopian fantasies very positively. Some people imagine that a utopian vision for the future is a good thing because it motivates people to cooperate, to work together, that it unifies people with diverse interests. And I've got to tell you, the exact opposite is true. I'll give you a real quick example. If I put together a coalition here at my university of all kinds of different people who think it's immoral to carry out vivisection on apes, because I find out there are some monkeys with experiments being performed on them here at the university. So we're all different people, but what unifies us, what makes us work together, bring this complaint to university board of directors, to the dean, to the provost, and to parliament, to the government. Maybe we do some protests or whatever it is. What unifies us is our moral concern over this. That group is going to include some people who support vivisection on rats, but not on apes. It's going to probably the majority of people who are really interested will be science students in that department who are not vegan and who don't share my values. But praxis is what unifies us. Political praxis. The actual difference you can make is what unifies us. Now, if we get into utopian visions of the future, like what would you do when the revolution comes, then we're divided much more deeply. Then all of a sudden we're fragmented into a whole bunch of different ideologies that are not concerned with what can be accomplished here and now, but are instead concerned with something hypothetical in the far off future. I actually had more to say on this subject, but I'm going to try to wrap this up right quick. It'd be great to have a video less than 10 minutes long on this channel for a change. Revolutionary change is not the most important kind of change in this world. Many of the most profound and important changes in human history have not been revolutionary in any way, including, for example, the Industrial Revolution, that we only describe as a revolution for that reason, because it's so important, but there's really nothing revolutionary about it. The other thing to remember is, as veganism moves closer towards that goal of just making meat and dairy carry some stigma for these reasons, to be somehow in the same category as cigarette smoking, then we're also going to see the mainstreaming of veganism in the same way that, if you were really a big fan of the Lord of the Rings books before it got made into a movie, you would suddenly feel confused and disappointed with all these people getting involved once the movie is released who weren't interested in it before. If you were reading the books for Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, and then the TV show happens, maybe you're happy that it becomes mainstream, more people are involved, but also now you're going to the same conferences, and there are all these other people there who weren't like the people. The movement isn't now what it used to be. Veganism will also go through these sorts of growing pains.